There is a particular quality to the soil of southern Norway, a dense and clay-rich darkness that holds within it the memory of everything that has ever been laid to rest beneath its surface. For centuries, the farmers who worked the land around the western shore of the Oslo fjord understood that their fields were not ordinary, that beneath the gentle rolling hills and the patches of birch forest there existed traces of a world far older than their own, a world that occasionally announced itself through the plough blade striking stone where no stone should have been, or through the strange, dark discolorations in the earth that appeared after heavy rains, forming shapes too regular, too deliberate to be the work of nature alone. The people who lived in these communities during the 19th century were not archaeologists, nor were they historians in any formal sense, but they possessed an intuitive understanding that the ground beneath their feet was saturated with the presence of the dead, and that the dead in this part of the world had not always been buried quietly or modestly. Some of them had been sent into the afterlife, aboard ships. The story of the great Viking ship burials of Norway is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire history of European archaeology, a chapter that has fundamentally reshaped our understanding of Norse civilization, of the artistry and spiritual complexity of the Viking Age, and of the remarkable individuals, many of them women, who wielded power and commanded reverence in a society that the outside world often reduced to a caricature of violence and plunder. But this story did not begin in the hallowed halls of a university or in the pages of a scholarly journal. It began in the dirt, with farmers and their shovels, with chance discoveries and local rumors, and with the slow, painstaking work of early archaeologists who understood that what lay beneath certain mounds in Vestfold County might represent something of incalculable significance, not just for Norway, but for the entire understanding of the medieval North. To appreciate the magnitude of what was eventually pulled from the earth, one must first understand the world that created it. The Viking Age, conventionally dated from the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, was not merely an era of maritime expansion and military conquest, though it was certainly both of those things. It was also a period of profound cultural achievement, of sophisticated craftsmanship, of complex religious belief, and of social structures that were far more nuanced than the popular imagination has typically allowed. The Norse people of Scandinavia during this period were farmers and fishermen, traders and explorers, poets and lawmakers, and they inhabited a world governed by a cosmology of breathtaking scope, a universe of gods and giants, of fate and honor, of worlds connected by the great ash tree Yggdrasil, whose roots plunged into wells of wisdom and whose branches held the heavens themselves. Death, in this cosmology, was not an ending but a transition, a passage from one state of existence to another, and the manner in which one was buried said everything about who one had been in life and what one was expected to become in the life that followed. For the elite of Norse society, for the chieftains, the kings, and the queens who sat at the apex of a hierarchical world built upon bonds of loyalty, kinship, and martial prowess, death demanded a spectacle. The great ship burial was the most elaborate and symbolically charged of all Norse funerary traditions, a practice in which a full-sized ocean-going vessel was hauled onto land, placed in a trench or upon the ground surface, and then loaded with everything the deceased would need in the afterlife: weapons and tools, food and drink, textiles and jewelry, animals both domestic and sacrificial, and sometimes, according to certain harrowing accounts preserved in the writings of foreign observers, human beings who were sent to accompany the dead into the next world. The ship itself was the central metaphor, the vessel that would carry the departed across the boundary between the living and the dead, a boundary that the Norse imagined not as a wall but as a sea, a vast and unknowable expanse that could only be crossed by those who had been properly equipped for the journey. Once the ship had been loaded and the body placed within it, the entire structure was buried beneath an enormous mound of earth and turf, a barrow that rose above the landscape like a monument, visible for miles, a permanent declaration that here lay someone of consequence, someone whose name and deeds were meant to echo through the generations. These burial mounds were never truly forgotten. The people who lived near them in the centuries that followed the end of the Viking Age knew they were there, knew that they marked the resting places of ancient lords and ladies, and treated them with a mixture of reverence and superstition. Some mounds were left untouched out of fear, their interiors guarded, it was believed, by the restless spirits of the dead, the Draugr of Norse folklore, beings who were said to sit within their burial chambers, jealously protecting the treasures that had been interred with them, ready to rise and punish anyone foolish enough to disturb their rest. Other mounds were not so fortunate. Over the centuries, many were opened by treasure hunters, by farmers seeking building materials, or by the simple, relentless processes of erosion and agricultural expansion that gradually wore them down and exposed their contents to the element. By the time the discipline of archaeology began to take shape in Scandinavia during the 19th century, many of the great burial mounds had already been compromised. Their treasures scattered, their ships reduced to fragments, their stories seemingly lost. But not all of them. In the Vestfold region of southern Norway, along the western coast of the Oslo Fjord, a series of monumental burial mounds survived into the modern era in varying states of preservation, and it was here, in this quietly beautiful stretch of Norwegian farmland, that three of the most important archaeological discoveries in European history would be made within the span of just over half a century, each one more astonishing than the last, each one pulling from the earth a Viking ship of extraordinary preservation and beauty, and each one fundamentally altering the scholarly and public understanding of what the Viking Age had truly been. The three ships, known today as the Tune ship, the Gokstad ship, and the Oseberg ship, form a trilogy of discovery that is without parallel in the archaeology of the medieval world, and their stories, from the moment they were first glimpsed in the soil to the decades of conservation, study, and display that followed, constitute one of the great intellectual adventures of the modern age. The first of the three to emerge was the Tune ship, discovered in 1867 on a farm near the town of Fredrikstad, on the eastern side of the Oslo Fjord. The circumstances of its discovery were, like so much in the early history of Scandinavian archaeology, a blend of accident and intention. A farmer named Ole Olsen Berger had long been aware that a large mound on his property was not a natural feature of the landscape, and when he began to dig into it, partly out of curiosity and partly in search of usable soil, he quickly encountered timbers that were clearly the remains of something built by human hands. Word of the discovery reached Olaf Rye, a professor of archaeology at the University of Christiania, as Oslo was then known, and Rye traveled to the site to supervise what became the first scientifically conducted excavation of a Viking ship burial in Norway. What he found was remarkable. Though the ship itself had suffered greatly from the weight of the mound above it and from the less than ideal preservation conditions of the soil, the Tune ship was a large clinker-built vessel constructed of oak planks riveted together in the overlapping fashion characteristic of Norse shipbuilding, and though much of its upper structure had been crushed and many of its timbers had decayed, enough survived to demonstrate that it had once been a seaworthy craft of considerable size and sophistication. The burial goods that accompanied it were relatively modest compared to what would later be found in the other two ships, but they included the remains of a horse and fragments of textiles and other organic materials that hinted at the richness of the original interment. The Tune ship was an important discovery, but it was only a prelude. 15 years later, in 1880, two boys playing on a farm called Gokstad near the town of Sandefjord on the western side of the Oslo Fjord noticed that the large mound on the property seemed to be oozing a strange, dark substance after a period of heavy rain. Their father, a farmer, began to investigate, and what he uncovered was the uppermost timbers of what was clearly a very large ship. The news reached the attention of Nikolai Nikolaisen, the president of the Society for the Preservation of Norwegian Ancient Monuments, a man who had spent years cataloguing and studying the antiquities of his country and who understood immediately that the Gokstad mound might contain something of extraordinary importance. Nikolaisen organized an excavation that began in the spring of 1880 and proceeded with a meticulousness that was, for the period, remarkably advanced, though by modern archaeological standards it would be considered somewhat rough. What emerged from the blue clay of the Gokstad mound was nothing short of breathtaking. A nearly complete Viking longship, over 23 meters in length, built of oak, with 16 strakes on each side and room for 32 oarsmen, a vessel of such beauty and technical perfection that it seemed almost impossible that it had been lying in the earth for nearly 1,000 years. The Gokstad ship was not merely well preserved, it was a masterpiece of naval architecture, a testament to the extraordinary skill of Norse shipwrights who had developed, over centuries of trial and refinement, a method of construction that produced vessels of remarkable strength, flexibility, and speed. The clinker-built technique, in which each plank overlapped the one below it and was fastened with iron rivets, created a hull that was both rigid enough to withstand the stresses of ocean travel and supple enough to flex with the waves, a quality that gave Viking ships their legendary ability to navigate both the open sea and the shallowest of rivers. The Gokstad ship's keel, a single piece of oak over 17 meters long, was the backbone of the entire structure, and the craftsmanship visible in its construction, the precision of the joints, the evenness of the planking, the elegant curve of the stem and stern posts spoke of a tradition of shipbuilding that was as much art as engineering. Inside the ship, the excavators found the remains of a man, a powerfully built individual who had been laid to rest in a wooden burial chamber constructed amidships, surrounded by an array of grave goods that included weapons, riding equipment, kitchen utensils, 6 dogs, 12 horses, and a peacock. This last item a vivid reminder of the far-flung trade networks that connected the Norse world to the markets of the Mediterranean and beyond. The man's skeleton showed signs of severe arthritis and old battle injuries, suggesting a life of both physical hardship and martial engagement, and later analysis would indicate that he had died in his 40s or 50s, likely sometime in the late 9th century during the very height of the Viking Age. The discovery of the Gokstad ship electrified the world of Scandinavian archaeology and brought the reality of Viking seafaring to life in a way that no written source ever had. Here was physical proof that the Norse had possessed the technology and the skill to build ships capable of crossing the North Atlantic. Ships that could carry warriors to the coasts of England, France, and Ireland, ships that could navigate the rivers of Russia to the gates of Constantinople, ships that could reach the shores of Iceland, Greenland, and even, as the sagas claimed, the distant coast of North America itself. The Gokstad ship was eventually transported to Christiania and placed on display, where it became an immediate object of national pride, a symbol of Norwegian identity at a time when the country was still struggling for full independence from Sweden, and a tangible connection to a heroic past that had previously existed largely in the realm of legend and saga. A replica of the Gokstad ship was even built and sailed across the Atlantic in 1893, arriving at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a voyage that demonstrated beyond any doubt that ships of this type were fully capable of the ocean crossings attributed to them in the medieval sources. But the greatest discovery was still to come, and it would emerge from a mound that had been sitting quietly on a farm in Vestfold County, its true contents unsuspected for over 1,000 years, waiting in the darkness of the blue clay for someone to finally ask what was inside. The farm was called Oseberg. It lay near the town of Tonsberg, on the western shore of the Oslo Fjord, in a landscape of gentle hills and broad agricultural fields that had been cultivated for centuries. On the property stood a large mound, roughly 40 meters in diameter and perhaps 5 or 6 meters high, a substantial feature in the landscape that had long been recognized as a burial mound of some kind, though no one had ever attempted a systematic excavation of its contents. The farmer who owned the property in the early years of the 20th century was a man named Oscar Rom, and in 1903, while digging into the edge of the mound to obtain soil or peat, he struck something hard with his spade, a piece of carved and decorated wood, dark with age but unmistakably the work of human hands. Rom had enough sense to recognize that this might be something important, and he contacted the authorities, who in turn contacted the man who would become the central figure in the story of the Oseberg discovery, a professor of archaeology at the University of Christiania named Gabriel Gustafson. Gustafson was, by the standards of his time, a careful and methodical archaeologist, a man who understood the importance of documentation and systematic excavation, and who was determined to avoid the mistakes and oversights that had marred earlier archaeological work in Scandinavia. When he arrived at the Oseberg farm in the spring of 1904 to begin a preliminary investigation of the mound, he could not have known that he was about to unearth the single most important Viking Age artifact ever discovered, a find that would consume the rest of his professional life, and that would, in its beauty, its complexity, and its mystery, pose questions that scholars would still be debating more than a century later. What Gustafson found, as he carefully removed layer after layer of the heavy blue clay that had sealed the mound for over 1,000 years, was a Viking ship of such extraordinary preservation and artistic magnificence that it seemed to belong not to the world of archaeology, but to the world of dreams. The Oseberg ship was smaller than the Gokstad ship, approximately 21.5 meters in length and 5 meters in breadth at its widest point, with 15 oar holes on each side, making it a vessel for 30 rowers. But what it lacked in size compared to its Gokstad counterpart, it more than compensated for in the sheer breathtaking quality of its decoration. The ship's prow and stern rose in high, elegant curves that terminated in spiraling serpent heads, and every available surface of the upper strakes, the stem post, and the stern post was covered in intricate carvings of a complexity and artistry that left the excavators stunned. The carvings depicted a swirling, interlocking world of serpents, beasts, and abstract patterns, a visual language that scholars would come to recognize as one of the high points of Norse decorative art, a style so distinctive and so accomplished that it was eventually named after the ship itself, the Oseberg style. The craftsmanship was of a quality that rivaled anything produced in contemporary Europe, a fact that challenged the prevailing assumption, still common in the early 20th century, that the Norse had been culturally primitive barbarians whose only contribution to civilization had been destruction and terror. But the ship itself, magnificent as it was only the beginning. As Gustafson and his team continued to excavate, working with painstaking care through the summer of 1904, they began to uncover the grave goods that had been placed inside and around the vessel, and the sheer volume and variety of these objects was unlike anything that had ever been found in a Norse burial context. There were sledges, 4 of them, each one elaborately carved with scenes of animals and human figures engaged in activities that seemed to have both narrative and ritual significance. There was a 4-wheeled wooden cart, the only complete Viking Age wagon ever discovered, its body covered in carvings that depicted scenes of startling violence and mystery. Figures grappling with serpents, men and women in postures that suggested ritual or mythological narratives, and images that seemed to draw from a symbolic vocabulary that scholars could recognize but not fully decode. There were beds and chests, buckets and barrels, agricultural tools and textile working equipment, including a beautifully preserved loom and spindle whorls and tablets for tablet weaving, the tools of a craft that was central to the economic and social life of Norse women, and that produced textiles of remarkable sophistication and beauty. There were the remains of tapestries, fragments of woven cloth that depicted processions of figures, horses and wagons, images that seemed to portray a ceremonial or religious event of considerable importance, though the precise nature of that event remained tantalizingly unclear. There were kitchen implements and food supplies, including the remains of apples, bread, and other provisions, as well as the skeletons of at least 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 small cows, all of which had been sacrificed as part of the funeral ceremony and placed in and around the ship to accompany the dead on their journey. And there were the dead themselves. Inside the wooden burial chamber that had been constructed on the deck of the ship, Gustafson found the remains of not one but 2 individuals, and it was here that the Oseberg discovery took on a dimension that no one had anticipated. Both of the deceased were women. This was a revelation. The prevailing assumption among scholars and the public alike had been that the great ship burials of the Viking Age were reserved for male warriors, for kings and chieftains who had earned their place in Valhalla through deeds of martial valor and who needed their ships and weapons in the afterlife to continue their eternal struggle. The idea that a ship burial of this magnitude and richness could have been created for women challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and status in Norse society, and it opened up a line of inquiry that would transform the study of the Viking Age in the decades that followed. Who were these 2 women? What had they been in life that they merited a burial of such extraordinary lavishness? And what did their interment in a ship, the quintessential symbol of Norse seafaring and martial culture, say about the roles that women could occupy in the Viking world? The skeletal analysis of the 2 women revealed that one was significantly older than the other, perhaps in her 70s or even 80s at the time of death, while the younger woman was probably in her 20s or 30s. The older woman showed signs of a condition that had caused her considerable physical suffering in the last years of her life, and some scholars have suggested that she may have been afflicted with a form of cancer or another debilitating disease. The younger woman's skeleton bore fewer obvious signs of pathology, but her precise cause of death remained uncertain. The relationship between the 2 women was, and remains, one of the great unsolved puzzles of Viking Age archaeology. Were they queen and servant, priestess and attendant, mother and daughter, or something else entirely? The question of which of the 2 was the primary occupant of the burial the one for whom the entire elaborate ceremony had been orchestrated, has been debated for over a century, and the answer remains elusive. Some scholars have argued that the older woman was the one of highest status, pointing to the fact that she was found in a position that seemed to suggest primacy within the burial chamber, and that her age and physical condition might have been consistent with a long life of privilege and authority. Others have suggested that the younger woman was the more important figure, and that the older woman may have been a servant or companion who was sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the afterlife, a practice that is attested in several written sources from the Viking Age, most notably the famous account by the Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking ship funeral on the Volga River in the 10th century, and described in graphic detail the ritual killing of a slave girl who was sent to join her dead master. The question is further complicated by the fact that the burial was disturbed at some point in the medieval period, probably by robbers who broke into the burial chamber and removed the most valuable metal objects, scattering and displacing the skeletal remains in the process and making it difficult to determine the original arrangement of the bodies with certainty. Despite the disturbance, the robbers seem to have been interested primarily in precious metals, gold and silver, and they left behind the vast majority of the wooden, textile, and organic objects that make the Oseberg find so remarkable. This is one of the great ironies of the Oseberg discovery. The very things that the medieval robbers considered worthless, the carved wood, the woven tapestries, the everyday objects of domestic life, are precisely the things that modern scholars consider priceless because they offer a window into the daily reality of Viking Age existence that no amount of gold or silver could provide. The metalwork that the robbers took is lost forever, and we can only imagine what treasures of goldsmithing and jewelry making were originally included in the burial. But what remained was more than enough to revolutionize our understanding of Norse art, craftsmanship, and material culture. The excavation of the Oseberg mound took the entire summer of 1904, and the challenges that Gustafson and his team faced were immense. The blue clay that had sealed the burial for over a millennium had created conditions of remarkable preservation, keeping out oxygen and preventing the wooden objects from decaying, but it had also compressed and distorted many of the artifacts, and the process of extracting them from the earth without causing further damage required extraordinary patience and skill. Each object had to be carefully freed from the surrounding clay, documented in situ, and then transported to the university in Christiania for conservation, a process that would prove to be as long and as difficult as the excavation itself. The ship, in particular, presented enormous logistical challenges. It had been crushed flat by the weight of the mound, its individual timbers pressing against each other in a dense, tangled mass that had to be disassembled piece by piece, each timber numbered and catalogued so that the vessel could eventually be reassembled. The sheer scale of the operation was daunting, and Gustafson drove himself relentlessly, working long hours in difficult conditions, determined to recover everything that the mound contained, and to do so with a degree of scientific rigor that would meet the highest standards of his profession. The artifacts began to arrive at the university in crates and bundles, filling rooms and corridors, and the work of conservation began almost immediately. This work would continue for decades, long after Gustafson himself had died, and it would involve some of the most innovative and sometimes controversial preservation techniques of the early 20th century. The primary challenge was that the wooden objects, though beautifully preserved in their waterlogged state within the clay, began to shrink, crack, and disintegrate as soon as they were exposed to air and allowed to dry. A method had to be found to stabilize the wood and prevent its destruction, and the technique that was eventually adopted involved treating the objects with a solution of alum, a mineral salt that was absorbed into the wood fibers and that, it was hoped, would provide the structural support needed to prevent collapse. The alum treatment was the best option available at the time, and it did succeed in preserving the basic form of many of the objects, but it came at a cost. Over the decades that followed, the alum crystals within the wood began to undergo chemical changes, becoming acidic and gradually breaking down the very cellulose fibers they were supposed to protect. By the late 20th century, conservators realized with growing alarm that many of the Oseberg objects were slowly self-destructing from the inside out, their wood becoming increasingly fragile and brittle, and that, without intervention, some of the most important artifacts in Scandinavian history might eventually crumble to dust. This conservation crisis, which continues to occupy the attention of experts at the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo to this day, is a sobering reminder that the work of archaeology does not end with excavation, that the responsibility of preserving and interpreting the past is an ongoing obligation that extends across generations, and that requires not only the techniques of today, but the as yet unknown techniques of tomorrow. The story of the Oseberg ship and its contents is not a story with a neat ending. It is a story that is still unfolding, still evolving, still challenging our assumptions and demanding our attention. More than 1,000 years after two women were laid to rest in a ship on a Norwegian hillside, and the earth was piled over them in a gesture of farewell that was also, it turns out, a gesture of extraordinary preservation. But let us return to the objects themselves, because it is in these objects, in their beauty and their strangeness, in the stories they tell and the questions they raise, that the true significance of the Oseberg discovery resides. Consider the animal head posts. 5 of them were found in the burial, each one carved from a single piece of wood, each one depicting the head of a snarling, grimacing beast with bared teeth and protruding eyes, each one executed in a style of carving so vigorous and so assured that it seems to pulse with life even now, over 1,100 years after it was made. The precise function of these objects is unknown. They have no obvious practical purpose. They were not parts of furniture or architectural elements, and they show no signs of wear that would suggest regular handling or use. Some scholars have proposed that they were carried in processions, perhaps as part of religious ceremonies or rituals associated with death and the afterlife. Others have suggested that they were intended to serve an apotropaic function, to ward off evil spirits, or to protect the dead from malevolent forces in the world beyond. Still, others have argued that they may have been associated with healing practices, or with rituals of divination, or with the cult of a particular deity, most often Odin, the All-Father, the god of war and wisdom and death, who was himself a master of magic and a traveler between worlds. What is beyond dispute is the extraordinary quality of the carving itself. The animal head posts represent at least 3 and possibly 4 distinct artistic hands, individual craftsmen whose personal styles can be distinguished by the way they handled the interplay of line and volume, the depth and character of their relief carving, and the degree of naturalism or abstraction in their rendering of the animal forms. Scholars have given these anonymous artists names based on the characteristics of their work: the academician, whose style is precise and controlled; the Baroque master, whose carvings are exuberant and deeply modeled; the Carolingian artist, whose work shows influences from continental European art; and others whose identities blend and overlap in the rich artistic milieu that the Oseberg objects reveal. The fact that multiple master carvers contributed to the furnishing of a single burial speaks to the wealth and social connections of the individuals being buried, and it suggests the existence of a sophisticated artistic culture in 9th century Scandinavia, a culture in which skilled craftsmen were valued, patronized, and given the freedom to develop distinctive personal styles within the broader framework of Norse decorative tradition. The cart, too, demands attention. It is the only complete 4-wheeled wagon known from the Viking Age, and its construction and decoration are remarkable. The body of the cart is covered in carved panels depicting scenes that have been the subject of intense scholarly debate since the moment they were first cleaned and examined. One panel shows a figure, apparently a man, being attacked or entwined by serpents, while other figures look on or participate in what appears to be a scene of ritual significance. Another panel depicts what may be a procession, with figures on horseback and on foot moving in a direction that suggests purpose and ceremony. The style of the carvings is distinctive, combining elements of the broader Oseberg artistic vocabulary with a narrative ambition that is unusual in Norse art, which more typically favors abstract or semi-abstract animal ornament over figurative storytelling. The cart itself, despite its elaborate decoration, was not a practical vehicle for everyday travel. Its turning radius is extremely limited, and its construction suggests that it was designed primarily for ceremonial use, for processions and rituals, in which the act of being transported was itself a symbol of status and sacred power. The sledges, of which 4 were found, reinforce this impression of ceremonial purpose. Each one is decorated with carvings of varying degrees of elaboration, and the finest of them, known as the academician's sledge, is covered in interlocking animal patterns of such density and precision that they seem almost to writhe and shimmer when viewed in changing light. The sledges were clearly designed for winter use, their runners shaped for travel over snow and ice, and their presence in the burial suggests that the funeral may have taken place during the colder months, or that the occupants of the burial were being provided with transportation appropriate to all seasons in the afterlife. A thoughtful and practical expression of care for the dead that is both touching and revealing. Among the most significant of all the Oseberg finds are the textiles, a category of artifact that rarely survives from the Viking Age because organic materials are so susceptible to decay. The blue clay of the Oseberg mound, by excluding oxygen and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria and fungi that normally destroy fabric, preserve fragments of woven cloth, tapestries, and embroidered textiles that offer an unparalleled glimpse into the textile arts of 9th century Scandinavia. The tapestry fragments are particularly important because they depict scenes that appear to show a procession or ceremonial event involving figures in elaborate dress, horses, wagons, and what may be representations of buildings or tents. The figures are rendered in a flat, stylized manner that is reminiscent of the pictorial tradition seen on the earlier Gotlandic picture stones from the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, and they provide invaluable information about the clothing, hairstyles, and accoutrements of the Norse elite during the Viking Age. The production of textiles of this quality required enormous investments of time, skill, and raw materials, and it underscores the importance of textile work as a form of artistic expression and social signaling in Norse society, a domain in which women played the central role and in which the ability to produce fine cloth was a mark of both personal accomplishment and household prestige. The question of who these women were, the older and the younger, has never been definitively answered, but it has generated a rich and fascinating body of scholarly speculation. One of the most prominent theories, proposed in the early 20th century and still widely discussed today, identifies the primary occupant of the Oseberg burial as Queen Asa, a semi-legendary figure mentioned in the Norse sagas as the grandmother of Harald Fairhair, the king who is traditionally credited with the unification of Norway in the late 9th century. According to the sagas, Asa was a woman of considerable power and determination, a queen who had her husband killed and who ruled a significant territory in the Vestfold region, precisely the area where the Oseberg mound is located. The chronological and geographical fit between the saga traditions about Queen Asa and the archaeological evidence from the Oseberg burial is suggestive, though far from conclusive, and many scholars have expressed skepticism about the identification, pointing out that the sagas were written down centuries after the events they describe, and that their accounts of early Norwegian history are heavily colored by literary convention, political agenda, and the inevitable distortions of oral transmission. More recent analyses, including radiocarbon dating of the ship's timbers and the skeletal remains, have placed the Oseberg burial in the year 834 or thereabouts, a date that is broadly consistent with the saga chronology for Queen Asa, but that does not, by itself, confirm the identification. DNA analysis of the two women's remains has produced some intriguing results, including the surprising finding that the younger woman may have had genetic origins in the region around the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean, a result that, if confirmed, would add yet another layer of complexity to the already rich tapestry of questions surrounding the Oseberg burial. Was this younger woman a captive, a slave, a foreign-born wife or concubine brought to Scandinavia through the far-reaching Norse trade networks? Or was she a member of the local elite whose ancestry happened to include a distant ancestor from the south or east? The DNA evidence, tantalizing as it is, does not provide a definitive answer, and the identity of the Oseberg women remains one of the great open questions of Viking Age scholarship. What the Oseberg burial does tell us, with a clarity and a richness that no written source can match, is something about the world that these women inhabited, about the values and beliefs that govern their lives, about the material culture that surrounded them, and about the extraordinary artistry that flourished in 9th century Scandinavia. It tells us that the Viking Age was not simply an age of war and plunder, though it was certainly that, but also an age of art and beauty, of skilled craftsmanship and sophisticated ritual, of social complexity and individual achievement. It tells us that women could occupy positions of the highest status in Norse society, that they could be honored in death with a lavishness that rivaled or exceeded anything bestowed upon male warriors and kings, and it tells us that the Norse had a relationship with the sea, with ships, and with the act of voyaging that went far beyond the merely practical, that reached into the deepest structures of their cosmology and their understanding of what it meant to be human, to live, and to die. The story of the Oseberg ship is also a story about the modern world's relationship with the past, about the ways in which we discover, preserve, interpret, and sometimes fail to understand the traces left behind by those who came before us. The excavation of 1904 was a monumental achievement, but it was also, inevitably, a product of its time, shaped by the techniques and assumptions that were available to Gustafson and his contemporaries, and limited by what they could not know about the chemical processes that would eventually threaten the very objects they had worked so hard to save. The ongoing conservation crisis, the debates about the identity of the two women, the evolving interpretations of the carved and woven images, all of these are part of the continuing life of the Oseberg discovery, a life that extends far beyond the moment of excavation, and that will continue as long as there are scholars and scientists willing to engage with the questions that this extraordinary find continues to pose. The world into which the Oseberg ship was born, the world of 9th century Scandinavia, was a place of extraordinary dynamism and contradiction, a society poised between the old ways and the new, between the pagan traditions that had governed life in the north for millennia and the Christian faith that was beginning to press inward from the south and west, carried by missionaries and merchants, and by the returning warriors who had encountered the new religion in the lands they raided and traded with. To understand the Oseberg burial and the civilization that produced it, one must look beyond the mound itself and consider the broader landscape of Norse society during this pivotal period, a landscape shaped by geography, climate, kinship, law, belief, and the restless, outward-reaching energy that drove the Scandinavian peoples to the farthest corners of the known world and beyond. Norway in the 9th century was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of petty kingdoms and chieftaincies, each one ruled by a local lord or king whose power rested on a combination of personal charisma, military strength, control of productive agricultural land, and the ability to attract and retain the loyalty of followers through the distribution of gifts and the provision of feasts. The institution of the hall, the great timber building where the chieftain presided over his household and entertained his warriors and guests, was the physical and symbolic center of this world, a place where alliances were forged and broken, where stories were told and poems recited, where the bonds of loyalty that held society together were renewed and strengthened through the rituals of communal eating, drinking, and gift-giving. The hall was also a place of display, where the chieftain's wealth and taste were made visible through the quality of the furnishings, the richness of the textiles that adorned the walls, the beauty of the weapons that hung from the pillars, and the abundance of the food and drink that was served to those who gathered within. The material culture of the Oseberg burial, with its elaborately carved sledges and cart, its fine textiles, and its abundance of domestic equipment, can be understood as a reflection of this whole culture, a final, permanent expression of the wealth and status that the deceased had enjoyed in life, transferred from the world of the living to the world of the dead in a gesture that was both memorial and provision. The economy of Viking Age Scandinavia was more diverse and more sophisticated than is often appreciated. While agriculture, particularly the raising of cattle, sheep and goats, and the cultivation of barley, oats and rye formed the foundation of the economy, the Norse were also deeply engaged in trade, both within Scandinavia and across vast distances that connected the fjords of Norway to the markets of the Islamic Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, and the kingdoms of Western Europe. The trade routes that ran through the river systems of what is now Russia, from the Baltic Sea down the Dnieper and the Volga to the Black Sea and the Caspian, were arteries of commerce along which flowed silver, silk, spices, glass, and slaves, the last of these being one of the most important and most troubling commodities in the Viking Age economy. The Norse traded in human beings on a scale that is sometimes underestimated, capturing men, women, and children during their raids on the coasts and interiors of the British Isles, Ireland, the Frankish lands, and the Slavic territories to the east, and selling them in the great markets of Hedeby, Birka, and the Rus trading posts along the Volga. The Arabic silver dirhams that flowed northward along these trade routes in exchange for furs, amber, and slaves have been found in hoards across Scandinavia, testimony to the scale and profitability of this long-distance commerce, and some scholars have argued that the influx of silver was one of the driving forces behind the expansion and increasing social stratification of Norse society during the Viking Age. The Oseberg burial, with its extraordinary richness, must be understood within this context of expanding wealth and deepening social hierarchy. The resources required to stage a funeral of this magnitude were enormous. The construction or acquisition of the ship itself, the commissioning of the carved sledges and cart, the production of the textiles, and the collection of the grave goods, the sacrifice of the horses and other animals, and the labor of building the mound that sealed it all within the earth. This was not a burial that could have been arranged by an ordinary family or even by a moderately prosperous farmer. It was a royal or quasi-royal event, a demonstration of power and piety that served not only to honor the dead but to reinforce the authority of the living, to announce to the community and to the wider world that the family and lineage of the deceased commanded the resources and the social capital necessary to send their dead into the afterlife in a manner befitting the greatest of the old Norse traditions. The religious dimension of the Oseberg burial is perhaps the most difficult aspect to reconstruct with confidence, because the pre-Christian religion of the Norse was never systematically recorded by its own practitioners, and the written sources that describe it, principally the Icelandic Eddas and sagas composed in the 13th century, were produced by Christian authors who were writing several centuries after the conversion and whose accounts are inevitably filtered through the lens of their own faith and literary conventions. Nevertheless, the broad outlines of Norse cosmology and religious practice are reasonably well understood, and they provide an essential framework for interpreting the symbolism of the Oseberg ship and its contents. The Norse universe, as described in the mythological sources, was organized around Yggdrasil, the Great World Tree, an immense ash that stood at the center of all existence and connected the 9 worlds that made up the cosmos. At the top of the tree sat an eagle, and at its base gnawed a serpent, Nidhogga, and between them scurried a squirrel named Ratatoska, carrying messages and insults back and forth, a vivid image of the dynamic, often contentious interplay of cosmic forces that characterized the Norse understanding of reality. Among the 9 worlds were Asgard, the home of the gods, the Aesir, who included Odin, Thor, Freya, and the other major deities, Midgard, the world of human beings, surrounded by a vast ocean in which dwelt the world serpent Jormungandr, and Hell, the realm of the dead, presided over by a goddess of the same name, a cold and shadowy place to which the ordinary dead were consigned, as opposed to the glorious hall of Valhalla, where those who had died in battle feasted and fought in an eternal cycle of violence and renewal, preparing for the final battle of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the forces of chaos would overwhelm the forces of order and the world would be destroyed and reborn. The ship, within this cosmological framework, was a vehicle of transition, a means of crossing the boundaries between worlds, and its presence in a burial context was a powerful statement about the nature of death as a journey, a voyage from the known world of the living to the unknown world of the dead. The Norse word for the funeral itself, the ritual sending off of the dead, was closely related to the language of seafaring, and the metaphorical association between death and ocean travel permeated every aspect of Norse funerary culture, from the ship burials of the elite to the more modest boat graves found in cemeteries throughout Scandinavia, in which ordinary individuals were laid to rest in small rowing boats or in settings of stones arranged in the outline of a ship, a symbolic vessel for a symbolic journey. The Oseberg ship, with its soaring prow carved in the form of a serpent and its elegant, flowing lines, was the ultimate expression of this metaphor, a real ship for a real journey, or so the builders and mourners believed, a craft that would carry its occupants across the dark waters that separated this world from the next. The serpent imagery that dominates the decoration of the Oseberg ship and many of its associated objects is worth pausing to consider, because it connects the burial to one of the deepest and most pervasive themes in Norse art and mythology. Serpents, dragons, and interlocking beast forms are the most common motifs in Viking Age decorative art, appearing on everything from brooches and belt buckles to runestones and church doorways, and their significance was clearly profound, though its precise nature remains a matter of scholarly debate. In Norse mythology, serpents are associated with both chaos and wisdom, with the destructive power of Jormungandr, the world serpent who encircles Midgard and who will rise from the sea at Ragnarok to do battle with Thor, and with the transformative, liminal quality of creatures that shed their skins and are reborn, that inhabit the boundaries between worlds, that move between the realms of the living and the dead. The serpent carvings on the Oseberg ship can be read as protective symbols, guardians of the vessel and its occupants, or as markers of the boundary-crossing nature of the journey upon which the dead were embarking, or as expressions of the vital, organic energy that the Norse saw in the natural world, and that they captured in their art with such extraordinary skill and intensity. The carved animal head posts found in the burial deserve further exploration because they represent some of the most enigmatic and artistically accomplished objects to survive from the entire Viking Age. Each of the 5 posts consists of a long shaft, roughly 1 meter in length, topped by the head of a beast, usually interpreted as a lion or a dragon, though the creatures depicted do not correspond exactly to any real animal and seem instead to be composite or mythological beings. The mouths are open, the teeth bared, the eyes bulging, and the overall effect is one of fierce, almost overwhelming intensity, as though the creatures are about to spring to life and challenge anyone who dares to approach. The surfaces of the posts are covered in intricate carvings that vary in style from one post to another, reflecting the hands of the different master craftsmen who produced them, and the sheer technical virtuosity of the carving, the depth of the relief, the precision of the interlace, the fluidity of the animal forms is astonishing by any standard. The function of these objects has been debated since the day they were excavated. One of the most compelling theories, proposed by several scholars over the years, is that they were associated with rituals of protection or exorcism, perhaps carried in processions or placed at boundaries to ward off harmful spirits.